So I'm going to do something I never do, and something I always tell my students never to do, to read your talk. But, you know, since I'm going to be talking about, where's this clicker here?
Oh, yeah. Just keep going.
Keep going. All right, there we go. Since I'm going to be talking about reading, I think it's legitimate, right, for me to read. It's also the case that I tried to do this within the 10-minute restriction, and it was like, no, it was more like a half an hour. So if I read it, I can do it much quicker. All right, so here we go. So for the past 40 years, my students and colleagues, Karen being one of my primary colleagues here at SDSU, as well as collaborators and labs around the world, I've been studying the brain systems involved in what Marty was just talking about, which is this amazing ability we have to use language and to understand what other people are with, understand other people programming our brains to behave in particular ways. So I've been really interested in that. So while we've done a lot of studies on many different aspects of language in my lab over the years, today I'm going to focus on one particular component part of language, which we call reading. And even more specifically, I'm going to focus in on a part of reading that we call visual word recognition. All right, so visual word recognition is basically the part of the reading system that allows you to focus your eyes, for example, on a word on a page, and to eventually get to the meaning of what that word is, which is illustrated here in this kind of thought bubble above this person's head. So the meaning of the word house. So, so why is it important to understand this? Why do we care about what happens when people read? Well, it's arguably the most important skill that we teach kids in school, right? Because reading is the backbone, if you will, for future learning. So without learning how to read, you really can't, basically navigate our world, right? There's just too many things that require reading for us to be able to function in the world without being able to do it. So, in particular, I'm going to be focusing on how, very simplistically, not nearly as complicated as the last talk, I'm going to be focusing on how this actually works, all right? So imagine you're looking at that word that I just showed you, the word house. How does that get translated into something that eventually becomes the meaning for that word? Well, first of all, you focus on it. The light rays bounce off of the word. They enter the eye. They're focused on the retina. Here's a blow up of the retina here. There are specialized cells, specialized neurons that convert the light energy into an electrochemical signal. So for example, if you're looking just at the letter E here at the end of the word house, the particular neurons here in the retina that are basically where the light from the E is striking will basically send a signal via the neurons in the eye all the way back through the optic nerve into the brain. And here's a very simplified diagram of how this works. So here's the retina here, here's the word house, and here is the pathway of information flow through this system, eventually, right, through midbrain regions here in the thalamus into visual cortex, and eventually into the occipital temporal region here in an area called the visual word form area. And then on to other brain regions I've just highlighted, one of them here, the anterior temporal lobe, where we think meaning takes place. So that's illustrated here in this next slide. Just kind of I've replaced the names of these areas with what we think is actually happening in these areas. So one of the things that's happening when the information arrives in visual cortex is that we start to extract the features of the letters that you're looking at in the word. Those make their way to this area here, this visual word form area, which is probably made up of a number of different subregions of cells that are responsible first for processing what the letters are in the word, and then eventually the visual word forms themselves, so what the words look like, and then eventually the activation of meaning here. Now you notice I've also added another node here into the picture where speech sounds are presumably being processed, right? So if you were listening to the word house being pronounced, this area would activate presumably the phonemes, the primitive parts of the speech sound that for the word house. And so what we imagine happens during learning to read is that there are links forged between the speech sound areas and the areas that come to represent the letters through a process that some people refer to as neural tuning. So basically what happens as you're learning to read is you learn how to map the speech sounds onto the letter representations in this area. So that is basically, yes, what is presumably happening when kids learn how to sound out words. All right, so in order to study this, you can see I've given up on reading. So in order to study this in my lab, we record people's brain waves, indicated here. And of course, people wear these stylish caps that have electrodes in them. We can record the electrical activity of the brain while people are, for example, looking at images or, in this case, symbol strings or words like this. And I'll quickly take you through a number of the brainwave phenomena that occur when people are reading. So the first signal that we're able to see when someone's reading a word is emanating from about this region here where the red dot is, probably area V4, and this is the P1 component of a brainwave. And any visual stimulus presented to a participant will generate a P1 component. And in fact, one of the things you'll see here is that if you're looking at letters or you're looking at symbols, the difference in the P1 is very small. P1 responds primarily to physical characteristics of the stimulus. So if it was big, or it was in green, or it was in one location versus another, the P1 would be very sensitive to that. But it doesn't care about whether something's a letter or a symbol or a picture or whatever. The next component part, right, this visual, the beginning of this visual word form area, does care. And in particular, there's a brain wave called the N170, which is what I'll be mainly talking about today, that does differentiate between letters, for example, and symbols. So here you're looking at what we call a difference wave, where we've subtracted the brain wave of symbols from a string of letters, and you'll see that there's this kind of prominent little peak here, right at about 170 milliseconds. So while the P1 was at 100 milliseconds, roughly 70 milliseconds later, you get this N170 component. And then later, shortly later, probably in a very nearby region, there's another network of neurons that respond very clearly, again, differentiating between words and symbols that we call the N250. So it's at about 250 milliseconds, roughly 60 or 70 milliseconds after the N170, that we know from lots of experiments is where the representation for visual word forms is probably happening. All right, and then lastly, once the information arrives in the anterior temporal lobe, and probably lots of other areas as well, but I'll just focus on the anterior temporal lobe, we get this final component, the N400, which we think reflects the processing of the meaning of the word. So surprisingly, right, it takes 400 milliseconds from the time, roughly 400 milliseconds from the time you first see a word to when you fully process its meaning, which is a little surprising, right? It's a little bit like the problem we were just talking about with you know, the fact that the brain gets programmed when someone speaks to you. Well, realizing what it is that you're reading actually happens about a half a second after whatever it was you were looking at. So reality is like a half a second behind, or we're a half a second behind reality as we're processing information like words and objects and things like this. All right, so let me show you one of the first studies to look at the N170 in adult readers. So there's a study by Ernst Maurer where he recorded the electrical activity from this one electrode right here, very close to where you would imagine if you were going to try to isolate the visual word form area where you'd want an electrode. And what he found is that when he looked at adult readers and compared the N170 to words and pictures, he also used symbol strings and other stimuli. The N170 was much larger, much more prominent for words than it was for these other types of stimuli. And it was also very much a left hemisphere phenomenon. Now, in the world of brain waves, very frequently things don't show up more on one side than the other, but the N170 to words really is very left lateralized. So why is that important? Well, remember back to that diagram I showed you with the, where the speech sounds are basically stored in the left hemisphere. And so the N170, probably coming from somewhere around the visual word form area, is probably there for a reason, right? It's close, relatively close to those speech sound areas. And so setting up that mapping from the auditory areas to the visual areas probably is one of the reasons why it is so left lateralized. All right, so here's what Ernst found in adults. He also ran a group of pre-literate kindergarten students, recording from that same electrode, and noticed that this same negativity, actually a little bit later, you might notice, but it did not differentiate between any of the different types of stimuli that he presented. Pretty strongly suggesting, right, that pre-literate kids obviously aren't making a big distinction between these different kinds of stimuli. The clever thing that he did is he brought these same kids back 2 years later when they were in the second grade and recorded from the same kinds of stimuli. And what he found was just after 2 years of reading education, the kids were now starting to show this distinction between these two kinds of stimuli. Another study I'll show you from my colleague Sarah Laszlo. She did something very similar to the Maurer study, only she studied kids of the same age. She studied third grade kids who could read, but she differentiated two groups of them, two subgroups, based on their phonological awareness skills. Phonological awareness is the ability that kids around the time that they learn to read basically show that they are sensitive to the sounds of letters, right? Letters and combinations of letters. So, for example, rhyming tasks are frequently used in assessing this type of ability. And so kids that had strong phonological skills, so the most phonologically aware kids, showed a much larger N170 component than kids that had lower phonological skills. So I think this study is the one that probably most convincingly shows that it's phonology, right? It's the mapping of the sounds onto the letters that's driving this N170 phenomena, and that is probably responsible for what's happening in this visual word form area. So let me now tell you about a study from our lab where we pretty much asked the same kind of question, but we did it in a group, two groups of participants. So hearing adult readers, so 32 hearing adult readers, and 32 congenitally deaf readers. And kind of like the phonological skill experiment I just showed you, these two groups of subjects both were competent readers. They were, in fact, matched on their overall reading skill. But the deaf readers, of course, not having access, right, they're congenitally deaf adults, so they don't have access to the rich phonology that hearing readers have. And so therefore, in learning to read, to become competent readers, they're presumably doing it in a very different way than learning these mapping rules from sound to letters. And what I think you can see here is that while the P1 component is very similar in these groups, it's a little bit larger in the hearing subjects than in the deaf. If you were to look at lateral stimuli, it actually would reverse. The deaf would actually have larger P1s to stimuli in the periphery. But notice that there's no difference in either group, really, between words and symbols in the P1. However, when you get to the N170, right, just 50 or 60 milliseconds later, you can see there's a clear, much larger over left hemisphere sites, N170 to words and symbols in hearing participants, and no difference at all in the deaf participants. And you can see that best here in these voltage maps. So this is basically just showing you the subtraction of words minus symbol strings and showing you the very large left hemisphere N170 in hearing readers, and really a reverse polarity effect in the deaf readers at the right occipital regions of the brain. Now, you might imagine this must mean that these later components that I talked about must also be different in hearing and deaf readers, right? If they're doing things differently at the level of letters and letter strings, then they must be doing things differently when it gets to activating visual word forms and then activating meaning. And if you thought that, you were wrong, because in fact, the two groups were actually almost identical, certainly statistically identical. In that same comparison, when you go just 50 or 60 milliseconds later and look at this N250 component, which, as I told you, reflects activation of visual word forms. And moreover, when you get to the N400 and meaning activation, again, statistically identical. So I will go back to reading my conclusion. All right, so what does all this mean? So, well, together these studies, I think, strongly argue for a highly plastic system that over a brief period of development is modified to accommodate the acquisition of a fundamental component of the reading process. It also suggests, I think particularly the deaf data suggests, that there's quite a bit of flexibility in how this skill actually gets laid down. In other words, how you learn how to map from letters to some other kind of representation. And that's it. Questions? Marty?
If you look at these kinds of studies in a language like Italian, where the mapping between words and sounds is not so
Crazy.
effed up, as we might say.
Yeah.
Do you see the same thing? The question is, do you need to reference what a word sounds like in order, if you've got a better mapping that way? Yeah.
Yeah, so the Maurer studies were done in German, which is not quite as shallow, I believe, of an orthography as Italian, but nevertheless shallower than English.
Yeah.
So, I mean, my guess is that yes. And Ernst is now in China and is doing studies there where, you know, there's absolutely no clue in the script to the sounds. And I haven't seen the developmental stuff that he's done with that, because that would actually be a different kind of, obviously, a different way that you learn, you know, how to read. If there's no clue to the sound in the characters. So good question. Yes.
I'm a person who has an internal monologue, so when I'm reading, I like hear all the words in my head.
Yeah.
Is there a difference in this kind of pattern for people who have an internal monologue versus people who don't have an internal monologue?
I have the internal monologue as well, so I can't speak from personal experience. So there's lots of reason to believe that once you become a skilled reader, that this pathway that I'm talking about may not be quite as important, and that, for example, once you get really quick and fast at reading, that the auditory part is probably not as necessary, but it's necessary for the learning part. So I'm not aware of any studies where people have actually tried to ask people if they have this or not, and whether there's a difference. I think the reason, even these are expert readers that we're talking about for the most part that show these M170 effects. So I think what you're looking at there is some kind of echo of what happened during learning, right? It's still there. You're still probably activating the phonological representations, but they might not be as necessary. And yes, so there might be individual differences in that.
So this is really interesting. So this N170 is really sort of the mid-level, right, or middle stage, if you will, in some way, between the early sensory and the later semantic and contextual integration. And I think it's really interesting what you showed us about the difference between words and symbols on the left, and for the hearing and the deaf people. But there has also been a lot of discussion on the N170 lateralization to faces versus words, right? So faces are more on the right, words are more on the left.
Right.
However, if I remember right, wasn't there evidence by the Hain or other groups showing that actually it's not lateralized in kids before they learn how to read, and then it lateralizes left to words and right to faces. So there's nothing about the right, as other people thought that somehow the right lateralization of the face-related N170 is somehow biological or something like that.
Yeah, and there is, yes, you're right. There's speculation that there's something about learning to read that forces the N170 to faces to be more right, apparently right, lateralized. I haven't kept up with that literature, so there may be some evidence for that. But it is true that in the Maurer studies, the N1, right, was bilateral to all the stimuli. There was no difference in laterality at all. And it's only once the kids started to learn to read that you start to see this left shift.
Yeah, that's right. That's interesting. Any other questions? Well, thank you to all the